So we want to thank all of the persons who were involved in us coming together today. I want to give a list of names of people who started meeting with us about 9 months ago to put this together. Dr. Lachlan Foro from Harvard University or Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Hospital. Sister Lillie Head, who a major part of our title today comes from the vision of Sister Lillie Head and the voices of our fathers and what it means to what do we do with what we now know. Dr. Kathleen McDuffie, formerly of the CDC, retired from the CDC, and was a tremendous help us to think through what is the best way to shape this conversation. And Dr. Riggins Earl, professor at ITC in theology and ethics. So we came together on a weekly basis, and sometimes twice a week, to try to tease out how best to bring together this very special symposium. Why is it special? 90 years ago, 623 men entered into an unethical so-called study. It was not a study as much as it was an unethical behavior. Studies requires protocol, it requires publications, it requires that at the very least, there should have been some kind of simple consent. Here we had a situation in which the men didn't even know they were in a study. Charles Pollard in 1972, when he was told he was in a study, he was shocked. So 50 years ago, the study came to a so-called ending. So 90 years ago, the syphilis study began, the so-called syphilis study. 50 years ago, its so-called ended. 25 years ago, was the apology by President Bill Clinton that brought about this national center that is now on the campus at Tuskegee University. So we come together this week to have this wonderful conversation on the moral determinants of health. What do we do with what we now know? In the last 25 years, we've come to know quite a bit of things, some very harsh realities. And the people on our panel today are persons who help us to come to some understanding. Among those people is Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble, who was instrumental in both the apology and the center coming to be where it is now at Tuskegee University. Dr. Rueben Warren, who was instrumental in that movement as well. Mrs. Lillie Head, who is the daughter of brother, is it Tyson Head? It's the last name Head. I'll say it, Tyson.
The last name is Tyson.
The last name is Tyson.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you. That her father was one of the men in the so-called study. And so several of the people on screen today and Dr. Vicky Mays. So several of the people on screen today had such a major part to play in what took place 25 years ago, and in some respects, what took place 50 years ago. And Dr. Rueben Warren, there's a special meaning for this event for Dr. Warren, because this year represents 50 years that Dr. Warren entered into public health service. So we just want to congratulate Dr. Rueben Warren on 50 years of service in public health. Now, as we go forward, thank you, Dr. Warren.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So this week is we have stuff chock full of nuts for Dr. Warren. So you will hear from him back and forth. That's why he usually does the part I'm doing now, but he's just kind of sitting still because we're going to be speaking of him so regularly. So today we have I see that the mayor's not here yet.
He's on. He's registered. He's registering now.
Oh, he's registering now. So as the mayor registers, the person after we have our mayor, that is Mayor Tony Haygood, who is a regular with us each and every year, and he's a brother. One time I need to see the mayor, and I said, let me see, how do I get to Mayor Haygood? So I went and I sat in his office until he came in. I said, this is what I love about being in Tuskegee. It's like Mayberry, just go sit in the office long enough and you'll see the mayor. And we had some amazing conversations. So I thank God for Mayor Haygood. So Mayor Haygood is going to present shortly. After Mayor Haygood goes, we have our provost, That is Provost S. Keith Hargrove. And interestingly enough, I came to know that when he was here many, many years ago at Tuskegee University, I think in the School of Engineering, he was here when the National Center was placed here 25 years ago. So it's good to know and good to see him here. So it's like a full loop. So, so you're here at this level of celebration and memorialization and commemoration. So thank you very much, Provost Hargrove. So is Tony Haygood, is Mayor Haygood on yet? Is that fully on?
I don't think so.
Oh, he's raised his hand. Oh, I know what happened. He's over on the other side. Miss Griffin, I need for you. Let's get Provost Hargrove to go. Provost Hargrove, I would like for you to go first. In the meantime, Ms. Griffin, please help Mayor Haygood come from the other side over to the webinar side.
Okay.
He's in the wrong space. All right, Provost Hargrove, can you go first, please?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting you said the other side, because I only see like 10 people on the screen, but it has 68 listed. So
Right.
There has to be another room somewhere, right?
Right.
Wonderful, wonderful. So on behalf of President Morris, and thank you so much for the invitation to share some opening remarks and welcome to all of you. Dr. Warren, Dr. Hodge, and all the individuals that I currently see on the screen, our guests, thank you for being here and for this opportunity to have this webinar, but also have some dialogue and also do some reflection as well. As you said, Dr. Hodge, it seems like, oh my goodness, 25 years ago, fresh out of graduate school, coming to Tuskegee in the College of Engineering. And so I was in fact here during my first stint at Tuskegee as a young faculty member when that acknowledgement was actually made under the leadership of Dr. Peyton. And it was very humbling and informative, and really advocated a consciousness, not only to those that were here, but I believe across the nation as well. And so since 1997 and 20 years later, I'm really glad that we're still having this conversation. And I like to believe also that from 97 to today, we're still making an impact with regard to consciousness, health equity, and many of the other challenges that underserved communities are faced. Back in 97, it was at what I would call a response to the truth, a response to the truth. Even though it happened many, many years later, as you mentioned, Dr. Hodge, it was eventually an acknowledgement and a response to the truth. And it kind of challenges us with regard to our livelihood in terms of self-responsibility with regard to our own health, and as well as our physical and mental health, but more importantly, how we serve others to also create a community of health and well-being as well. But even since then, and even till now, with the Bioethics Center and the outstanding, well-qualified faculty and staff that support them on this campus of Tuskegee University, we're still making an impact with regard to overall health of underserved communities, and in particularly the African-American community. There's work happening on this campus related to prostate cancer. There's work on this campus related to genomics with regard to how does that impact health equity, again, for underserved communities. There's work on this campus that focus on the translation of evidence-based knowledge with regard to our well-being, not only for this particular community, but rural communities as well. All those things are happening at Tuskegee University. So a lot of times people talk about Tuskegee, focus on its legacy, and that's great. But I also want to acknowledge that today and in the future, Tuskegee University continues to be at the forefront in looking at healthcare and focus on the well-being mentally and physically of underserved communities, and in particular African American as well. So again, I say thank you, Dr. Warren, for the invitation, for these opening remarks, Dr. Hodge and others I see on this on the screen. Again, on behalf of Dr. Morris, she sends her regards, and certainly this webinar and the next 3 days is an opportunity to enhance all of our consciousness, our knowledge about what we know, and what do we do with that knowledge with regard to the overall quality of life for all of us. So again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to learning more in the days ahead. Thank you, sir. That little red microphone in the bottom left.
Well, you have to start that. What I said was, thank you very much, Dr. Hargo, for those warm greetings. And we appreciate that, especially the expressions of what is going on now on the campus with the unveiling of the Cancer Research Center. That is especially amazing. Thank you very much. That the conversation that started years ago demonstrated that we're still on the cutting edge at Tuskegee University of what's happening next for Black and brown people in this country and around the world. So thank you so much. Thank you also very much for the greetings from the President Charlotte Morris, who is a constant support of what we are endeavoring to do. Thank you. Now I see that Mayor Haygood is in the other room, but Mayor, I think Mayor, we can hear you actually, so you can speak. Well, there you go. All right. Okay. All right. Good to see you, Mayor Haygood. How you doing today?
Doing great. How you doing, Dr. Hodge?
I'm doing fine. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, the Mayor of Tuskegee, Alabama, Mayor Tony Haygood.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and particularly great afternoon because of the work that you're doing as we recognize the 25th anniversary of the apology related to the government study related to syphilis that was done in and around Tuskegee, Alabama and Macon County. I'm particularly excited today because and it will echo somewhat of what Dr. Hargrove said, that the work that continues to be done. So we can talk about the anniversary. We applaud those who are working on reliving and looking at the past and the things that we have to lift up to make sure we recognize what was done, we recognize the inequities, we recognize what needs to be done. Thank Dr. Lillie Head, Mrs. Head, for the work that she's doing with the Ancestors Group. And so that's critical for us to recognize that. But most important is what each of you do every day right now as we relate to medicine and the developments in our community, particularly African-American community and people of color. That because of the study that was done, as you know, there's a high degree of mistrust in our community. So when new developments come out, we have to decide how to deal with that. We have to decide how to deal with it from a public health standpoint. We have to decide how to deal with it in our communities as elected officials, because people will look to us for information. So I want to thank Dr. Warren, thank Tuskegee University for the guidance that they've given in this setting. COVID-19 and other situations have put us in a very challenging setting. So as they look back, people look back to Tuskegee University. They look back to the work that you're doing. They look for the guidance from you and each one of you in your different areas that you serve in throughout this country to give guidance. And because of that, we've made some good choices as we see. We've still got a lot to do. So I applaud you for the work that you're doing. I ask you to continue and be willing to do, as I have to say about my good friend, Dr. Warren, to ask those tough questions, to push us, to pull us together. Because I'll tell you, when COVID-19 came out and everybody was going against it, Dr. Warren put together a set of questions along with others at Tuskegee University and called us into a dialogue on the screen and said, let's talk about this. Let's find out, what are you thinking? What are our hesitations? What are our concerns, and how do we deal with it? Good information is most critical now throughout the nation. Now, as you know, I'm an elected official. I was an educator, and I still am an educator, but you saw what elected officials did, politicians more than elected officials or statesmen did during COVID-19. They took it and used it as a political tool for whatever they wanted to, and they ignored the consequences upon people. Well, that's what the government state on syphilis did. So we have to keep this lifted up. We have to keep it recognized. We have to lift up those who are still out on the battlefield, fighting the charge to keep things fair and equitable and looking toward not only the current situation, but toward future generations. What we do today impacts future generations. And because you're there, you're vigilant, you're on the ground, you're fighting the battle, you're keeping your eyes on what's going on, that keeps us safer and gives us a greater level of confidence. And with that, I will continue to look toward you as a collective group of professionals, of scientists, as medical professionals, to give good guidance to us, because you're the people that we have a level of confidence in. We have to connect to a set of people we have a confidence in, and then we can share what we get with others. So again, I thank you today for the work that you continue to do, which is critically important. I thank you for lifting up what happened in the past so that people know and don't forget, and hopefully, prayerfully, this will never happen again. I thank the president at the time who brought about the apology. It took a lot of courage, President Clinton and others, to bring this about and to bring this forward and to have us recognize the mistakes of the past so they don't become mistakes in the future. So thank you today. I applaud you, ask you to continue to do the great work that you're doing. And we give our best from Tuskegee, Alabama. We bring our greetings and welcome you and say, hey, come to Tuskegee whenever you get a chance. We got homecoming this weekend. If you can make it down here, because hey, it's going to be a great time. This is TU, and you know it. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Wait a minute. I went off, but I'm back on again. I'm back on. So thank you very much, Mayor Haygood, for representing Tuskegee, the city, and representing Tuskegee University in so many ways. So we thank you so much for bringing those very warm welcome. Today, ladies and gentlemen, as with every day in each session, we will have our bioethics honors students being hosts to our invited participants and respondents, or presenters. Today we have two young people. One is Kai Nash, and the other one is Bianca Alcina. So this afternoon, the first session, we will be representing. Representatives will be Kai Nash. Kai Nash is a freshman chemistry major on the pre-med track and senator of the student chapter of the American Chemical Society at Tuskegee University. During his time in high school, he served in a variety of leadership roles like class president, varsity team captain, and student ambassador of the Student Health Advisory Committee of MISD. While serving as class president, he was able to raise over $30,000 to donate to a local children's hospital and host a multitude of volunteering events for his class, including an annual Christmas shopping event. Kai played 3 years of varsity football, winning District 558 defensive MVP and 3 years of academic all-district honors. Kai was a 3-year member of the National Honor Society where he completed over 150 hours serving his community in a multitude of ways. Let me say to you today that this young brother who is serving as our first host is in good, the Marathon Honors program is safe with young men like Kai. So Kai, thank you so much for volunteering today. So I present to you Mr. Nash, and he will present to us our first speaker for today, Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble. Hi.
Thank you for having me. Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble is University Professor of Medical Humanities at the George Washington University. She is the first woman and African American to hold this prestigious endowed faculty position. She is also a professor of health policy in the Mikan Institute School of Public Health and professor of American Studies in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Gamble is adjunct professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. Throughout her career, she has worked to promote equity and justice in medicine and public health. A physician, scholar, and activist, Dr. Gamble is an internationally recognized expert on the history of American medicine, racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare, public health ethics, and bioethics. She is the author of several widely acclaimed publications on the history of race and racism in American medicine and bioethics. Public service has been a hallmark of her career. She has served on many boards and chaired the committee that took the lead role in the successful campaign to obtain an apology in 1997 from President Clinton for the United States Public Health Syphilis Study at Tuskegee. She is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the Hastings Center. A proud native of West Philadelphia, Dr. Gamble received her BA from Hampshire College and her MD and Ph.D. in History and Sociology of Science from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Kai, for such a wonderful and generous introduction. And it's really nice to be back at Tuskegee, although virtually. And I want to thank the organizers of this session for inviting me, especially around the 90, 50, 25 anniversary. The first thing that I want to say is that that I first learned about the United States Public Health Syphilis Study at Tuskegee. It's nice to be at a place where I don't have to explain why I don't call it the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, because I think it's important to put the onus on the Public Health Service as the major driver of a study. I do call it a study because the science at the time, it was considered a study, and there were publications about the study in medical journals. So I will be calling it a study. Now, when Dr. Warren sent me the invitation, he said he wanted me to talk for 15 minutes about the history of the study. Now, there is no way in the world that I could talk only in 15 minutes about the history of the study. So he really has given me a tough assignment here. And so what I decided to do was, instead of doing an overall history of the study, is to talk about the multitude of ways the study has been framed. But first, I'm going to say I first learned about the syphilis study. So maybe this is a part of the 50th of the anniversary, is the 50th year that I first heard about the study, was when I was an undergraduate at Hampshire College. And I read about the study in the New York Times on July 26, 1972. The day before, on July 25th, 1972, was the first public revelation about the syphilis study. And I make a distinction between public revelations and professional revelations, because, as I stated, the study had been published in about a dozen medical and public health journals. So it was not hidden from the scientific community. But on July 25th, 1972, in an article in the Washington the Washington Evening Star and Daily News was an article with the headline, "Human Guinea Pigs, Syphilis Patients Died Untreated." And this was the first public revelation about the syphilis study, written by Jean Heller of the Associated Press. And for me, I never realized that by reading the newspaper the next day, that this study would have an impact on my career. Now, I went and did my senior thesis on the syphilis study. Friends of mine like to point out that I am milking my senior thesis from college for almost 50 years now, but I don't think they chose as good as well as I did in terms of the topics. So as I said, I am going to look at the different ways the study has been framed instead of going into all the details about the study. But I do want to point out that the U.S. Public Health Syphilis Study at Tuskegee lasted for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, that there are some historians who have called it the longest non-therapeutic study in history. And it involved approximately 427 Black men from Macon County, Alabama, many of whom were poor, but not all were poor. I mean, there's a mantra out there, it's like 420 sharecroppers who could not read. That is not true. Who reportedly had latent syphilis. And this is crucial to the story, that the men supposedly had latent syphilis, so they could not pass it on to their sexual partners, which was also not true, because that when by the study ended, about 22 wives, 17 children, and 2 grandchildren tested positive for syphilis. And there were 185 men in the study who were controls in the study. But if they tested positive for syphilis, they were moved to the group with syphilis. So that's the general overview. But there are a couple of things that I think are critical here. And one of the ways the study has been framed is that a breach of research ethics. And that was the first way the study was framed, as a breach of research ethics. For example, because of the deception regarding treatment, the men were told that they were being treated for their bad blood or their syphilis. So they were told they were being treated. And as a historian, one of the things I think is critical to understand is that there was a treatment for syphilis in 1932. It was not as efficient or effective as penicillin later proved to be, but there was a treatment. Another way of looking at it is that if today, we might treat, say, HIV/AIDS in a particular way, 50 years from now, people will look back and say, I can't believe that's how they treated HIV/AIDS. But you have to look at it in terms of the science of the time and the medicine of the time. And there was a treatment for syphilis, which was denied to the men because they were told they were being treated. So the first way the study has been framed, as I said, is a breach of research ethics, deception regarding treatment. Another way was a violation of codes of ethics. For example, the Nuremberg Code that came about in 1947 after the Nuremberg trials of Nazi physicians. So this looks at it in terms of a breach of ethics. But also the other thing of looking at this as a breach of research ethics is that it puts this emphasis of the men in the study as vulnerable, not as men and families in vulnerable situations. So it almost made that these men had this inherent vulnerability, which meant they could not make decisions on their own. So that's, and the other way of looking at this as a breach of research ethics, and if you were to look at the syphilis study in terms of this lens of research ethics, you would then go to things such as the Belmont report, which came up with ethical standards of people in clinical trials and research. But I think another way of looking at the syphilis study, which is not talked about as much, but I think is critical if we look at this in terms of the history of African Americans in medicine and healthcare. And that is the study, the syphilis study, as a study of racial difference and racial inferiority. Now, there's a long history in medicine and public health written by scientists. And I am, I am want to use the word pseudoscientists. These were scientists who were established and accomplished at their time, writing about the inferiority of Black bodies and the differences in Black bodies. Because I think if you say it's pseudoscience, it's like, oh, those were the people on the fringe. No, these were people who were leaders in medicine, who were part and parcel of the medical establishment. So there's a long history, as I said, of thinking about racial differences. And some of these racial differences were used, one, as a justification for slavery. They were also used as a justification for African Americans not having particular positions. For example, we have there was an observation during the antebellum period when Black people were enslaved that Black people, say, for example, in South Carolina, did not get malaria. And so what it happened was that this was used to say, well, Black people's bodies showed that they should be enslaved because they did not get malaria. Well, it turns out that that was, in some cases, a correct observation, that Black people with sickle cell trait did not get malaria. But it was used for a political purpose of saying Black people should be enslaved. And so the thing about the syphilis study, it is part and parcel of these studies about that Black bodies are different, because one of the study's design was predicated on this epidemiological finding that the wide disparity in patterns of disease between African Americans and whites, that somehow Black people were a syphilitic race, that syphilis was a different disease in African Americans than it was in white Americans. So that these differences in Black bodies is, or the presumed differences in Black bodies was one of the things that drove the syphilis study. So for example, it was believed that Black people did not get some of the neurological consequences of syphilis. The reason being, according to some of the medical reports, was that Black people did not use their minds as much as white people. Black people were thought to get the more cardiac manifestations of late syphilis. I never read anything that said that's because Black people were using their hearts more, but anyway, it was thought to be that this was a difference in African Americans. The other thing that when we talk about the syphilis study, I think it is an historical example of racial inequities in health and healthcare. Now, those of us in public health know that it's important to look at diseases, the factors that cause diseases in a broader context. Some people talk about, in terms of the social determinants of health. And in 1929, Thomas Perrin, who was one of the physicians from the Public Health Service involved in the syphilis study, wrote, the poverty, talking about Macon County in 1929, the poverty was worse than anything I had in long years of, that I had seen in long years of work in the rural South. The houses were tumbled down shacks, many without floors, no furniture, and only a few rags for bedding. In this environment, we found the saturation point of syphilis. In about 39.8% of all age groups of the colored population, the test was positive. So there was a need for interventions in Macon County to help African Americans with syphilis, but not just with syphilis, other diseases such as tuberculosis and heart disease. And so this is an example of a racial inequity in healthcare. And many of the, one of the things that's a critical part of the story of Tuskegee University in healthcare was that in many cases, Tuskegee Institute took up the slack in terms of providing health services for African Americans. And as the provost was talking about things that were happening today at Tuskegee University with regard to healthcare, it's important to understand too that that what is going on today in terms of health, improving the health status of African Americans is part of the legacy of Tuskegee University and Tuskegee Institute in providing services for African Americans. For example, the John A. For example, National Negro Health Week was originated at Tuskegee. The work on polio that was done at Tuskegee. So that's a critical factor in looking at the syphilis study. Another way the syphilis study has been framed, and this is what I spend a lot of time talking about, and that is that the syphilis study is a major factor in African Americans' lack of trustworthiness in medicine and public health. Now, I don't use the word distrust, or I don't use the word mistrust, because how it has been used so often is that it's almost like an inherent trait of Black people, that Black people don't trust. Somehow there's this mantra, Black people don't trust of medicine. Many Black people do trust medicine. Some don't, but it's not because of the syphilis study. For some people, it might be the syphilis study, but I think, and I've been asked to talk a lot about this, especially with COVID-19. And it's somehow, I think, is a certain amount of laziness to say, well, it's the syphilis study why Black people don't take vaccines. Current data shows that more Black people are taking COVID vaccines than white Americans. So I think we need to racialize it that way in terms of figuring out why white people aren't taking vaccines. But this whole discussion about, well, it's the syphilis study that has led to African Americans' lack of trustworthiness. And the reason I don't use the word mistrust, as one, I said, is become an inherent, it was a trait of Black people. But I think it's important to raise the question, what have you done to earn my trust? What have you done to gain my trust? And one of the things I've done some research where I have shown that attitudes of African Americans towards medicine and public health predated the public revelations of the syphilis study. And I want to read you something that came about from Dr. Kinney, who was Booker T. Washington's physician. And he wrote this in 1941 in the Journal of the National Medical Association. And it was an article entitled "The Second Annual Oration on Surgery, the Negro's Contribution to Surgery." After he lists all these African-American surgeons and some of their contributions, he writes, "In our discussion of the Negro's contribution to surgery, there is one phase not to be overlooked. That is what I may vulgarly and at the same time seriously term the guinea pig phase. Untold thousands of other Negroes have been used to promote the course of science. Even Negro physicians, surgeons, and nurses at times wince at the scenes. I suggest that a monument be raised and dedicated to the nameless Negroes who have contributed so much to surgery by the guinea pig route. So that it wasn't just about the syphilis study. And the other thing that when I said that it's a certain amount of laziness to say it's the syphilis study, is that it might be in particular communities on why there is tensions between African Americans and medicine. For example, in my hometown of Philadelphia, and the relationship between West Philadelphians and the University of Pennsylvania, it might have a lot to do with the fact when there were protests in West Philadelphia, the Penn police were there with the Philadelphia police, and tear gas canisters are shot off. So, I mean, I think it involves us trying to be more rigorous about the use of the term. It's because of the syphilis study. And finally, I'm so happy to see that Carmen Head Thornton is here on this call. And Carmen, I don't know if you remember this, but several years ago, you gave me a picture of your sitting on your grandfather's knee. And you said in this that one of his favorite Bible quotes were, whatsoever you do to the least of my people, that you do unto me. And many times I finish my presentations on the syphilis study with that quote and the picture of Carmen on her grandfather's lap. And that's because in the final analysis, the syphilis study was experienced at a personal and a family level. And that is something that we can never forget. And so I am really happy to be on this panel with Mrs. Lillie Head. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Northington Gamble. For the record, I have placed your article Under the Shadow of Tuskegee in the chat room. I think we need to read it because it speaks a lot what you just said.
Thank you so much.
And one of the things that, and before we get to a question, and by the way, I want to encourage people to put questions. We have a few minutes for question and answer before we move on to the next person, to put questions and answer, put questions in the Q&A box. The first question is actually by the provost of Clyde Nashville. I'll ask that in a minute. But what I wanted to ask of you, Dr. Northington Gamble, is you spoke to the issues with distrust and mistrust and the broader spectrum of the historical context of why Black people would be distrustful, not Tuskegee. So in the article you call it Under the Shadow of Tuskegee. Can you just give a couple lines of what that article says by including a couple of illustrations about other historical basis for distrust?
Yes, I mean, for example, in the article, I talk about the use of Black bodies in anatomical dissection. And actually there is a new book just came out a couple of weeks ago by Christopher D.E. Willoughby called The Masters of Science, that looks at how Black bodies were used in anatomical dissections. So that's an example. The other examples that I use are Black women afraid to go to the hospital because, as one of them wrote, I'm afraid to go to Hahnemann Hospital because they tell you you need a surgery and you don't need a surgery, and next thing you know, you can't have any babies. So that there is a long history that predated the syphilis study. But the other thing that I think is important for us to understand too is that the importance of understanding day-to-day, everyday racism, and that affects how I think people interact with the medical community and public health community more so than the syphilis study. I'm not saying the syphilis study is not important, but I'm saying is that people have been, I think, too quick to say, well, it's the syphilis study, as opposed to trying to find out, other reasons.
Thank you so much. By the way, you just undergirded one of the sessions coming up, which is maternal mortality. That's a session that'll be on Thursday. So we appreciate that.
Okay, I'm glad to do that.
Exactly. Okay, so Brother Kai Nash, would you please ask the question?
Okay, so Dr. Provost asks, considering the times of the 1930s to 1972, how confident are we that other unethical studies were not completed in these communities?
Are we talking about 1932 to 1972? I mean, the thing is that with the syphilis study, the reason why we know as much as we do is that it was a government study, and then there were some records. When I mentioned that when I was an undergraduate, I did my senior thesis on the syphilis study, and I wrote to the CDC as an undergraduate saying, well, I know there's this study, I've heard about this study, can you send me any information? They sent me a whole package of articles about the syphilis study. I mean, I don't think they realized what they were doing when they did that. So, I mean, I think right now is that there might have been other studies, but this went on for 40 years. There might have been other studies that were of shorter duration, but we just haven't found out about them.
Okay, your next question is, do you believe that the trauma as a result of the United States Public Health Service syphilis study in Macon County, Alabama, is directly correlated with the hesitance of Black and non-Black Americans to receive the COVID-19 vaccination?
I mean, I think that it's overstated. I think that for some African Americans it is, but it's overstated. One of the things that I have in my Google my Google alerts, my Google Scholar alerts, and my Google alerts is the Tuskegee syphilis study. I get something every day in both my Google alerts and my Google Scholar alerts saying, well, it's because of the syphilis study. As I said, I think the syphilis study for some people has played a role, but I think it's been totally overstated. And that's not to say we don't address the syphilis study, but it's to say there is the syphilis study, but that I think institutions need to find out what is going on in their communities. Now, the other thing is that with African Americans, that it's been a successful campaign. And I think that part, somehow when there was the belief that Black folks weren't socially distancing, Black folks weren't taking the vaccines, that was more the story, that the success that how Black communities have come together to work with vaccines, that is, I think, has become less of a story.
Can I add something if you don't mind?
Hi, Carmen.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. It's good to see you. It's been some time, but
Yes.
You mentioned you were so kind when you said several years ago. That was more than several years ago.
Carmen, we're at that age now. It's like, that's how we say it. Because I know how long ago it was. I was still in Wisconsin, and I left Wisconsin over 20 years ago.
Yeah, so that was the summer of 1997.
Yes, it was.
And I had just really started working and launching my public health career at the CDC National AIDS Clearinghouse, and just finished my undergraduate from Howard University, and just like you have your Google alerts for the syphilis study and read all of the different related articles that come up, I also have Google alerts on the syphilis study as well. And every time I get one, I stop and I read the link or read the article. And it's just so interesting that, yes, the syphilis study certainly is not the only reason that there's hesitancy in getting the vaccine. However, the syphilis study is my family's history.
Right.
It's my family's legacy. So oftentimes when we're reading, or at least when I'm reading about what a researcher or an expert in the field is saying, there's such an abrasiveness that is communicated or articulated in some of these stories. I even read one article where it said, Tuskegee, Tuskegee, Tuskegee. I am so sick and tired of hearing about and talking about Tuskegee. And they were mentioning this in reference to the vaccine. And so as a family, there was a recent video, I think, that was done where one of the experts was talking about all of the other shameful, horrible medical experimentations that have happened on African-American communities. You mentioned the sterilization of the women in South Carolina, and so on and so forth. Yes, atrocious. And Tuskegee or the syphilis study is not the only example of these instances. It is the longest non-therapeutic, unethical study that happened in the United States, or if not, documented history. It still is the longest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I feel as though when researchers are saying that, it's almost like they're comparing apples to oranges,
Mm-hmm.
where they're trying to make some comparison where, one community scars are bigger than another community scars.
Right.
And to be honest with you, it's offensive and it's insulting, and I find it very inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm working on a way to communicate that, to share that, because I do think that information should be disseminated. The syphilis study impacted many families and
Mm-hmm.
impacted there's hundreds of descendants, and we're alive. We're reading this information, and there's some sensitivity that should be placed upon what's been shared. That's just missing today.
Carmen, thank you for saying that, because that's how come when I said that I end my talk with you on your grandfather's lap, in terms of this is like a story of what happened to families too. That I think, and I try to get my students to understand that underneath these statistics, that there are individual lives, and for them to understand that. And anything that I can do to help you to get that out, I will be more than happy to help you.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
Mr. Nash, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
What methods do you suggest on how to keep the syphilis study relevant for our next generation of college students, public health practitioners?
I mean, I think, one of the things that Carmen Head Thornton just, talked about is to continue to make sure we talk about the syphilis study. That I think, that the work of the Bioethics Center is critical. I think that it is something that should be a part of public health and medical school curricula. So I think that those are some of the things. I mean, and the other thing too is one of the things that one of the myths around the syphilis study that I'm constantly fighting is that the men were injected with syphilis. That is the myth that will not die. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us, and I think one of the things that we've learned thus far this morning, it's incumbent upon us to remember or to let people understand that this impacted many families, and not to be dismissive. It's like, I have, Carmen, you just helped me think about something that I've heard people say, well, that happened such a long time ago. Yes, but it is still impacting trauma on individual families, and it's important for us to understand that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Northington Gamble. We appreciate all you've done for us.
Thank you, Kai.
So now we're introducing Mrs. Lillie Jules Tyson Head. She is a daughter of Freddie Lee Tyson, one of the 623 men whose legal health rights were violated in the United States Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee and Macon County, Alabama, from 1932 to 1972. She is a daughter of Johnny May Neal Tyson. Ms. Head is passionate about fairness and social justice and treating everyone with dignity and respect. Mrs. Head is president of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit organization founded by descendants in 2014 to transform the legacy of the United States Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee and Macon County, Alabama. The organization's purpose is remembering, celebrating, and honoring the 623 men who suffered greatly from the study. As president of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation, Mrs. Head is committed to keeping alive the men's stories and promoting education. The organization connects descendants across generations, provides annual scholarships to descendants, participates in the research project, The Untold Story, offers support and guidance to the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. While pursuing all other strategic plans, in June of 2022, the foundation entered a partnership with the Milbank Memorial Fund to promote equity and trust in medical care. She is active in different ministries at her church, Resurrection Catholic. She volunteers at the Booker T. Washington National Monument in Hardy, Virginia, the birthplace of Booker T. Washington. Mrs. Head retired as a physical education / health teacher and education consultant after 33 years from the Waterbury, Connecticut public school system. She's a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute, where she received a Bachelor's of Science degree in physical education. She received her master's degree in physical education from Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, Connecticut, and her education and administrative leadership graduate degree from the University of Bridgeport in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She has received professional recognitions from her colleagues and civic awards, recognizing her leadership, educational initiatives, program management, and service to the Waterbury community. Mrs. Head, it has written numerous articles for medical research journals, appeared on international, national, and local news networks of advocating the importance of the COVID vaccines. She has appeared in several documentaries promoting the mission of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation and revealing untold stories about the 623 African-American men who were victims in the USPH SUS Negro male. Mrs. Head and her husband, Wilbert, now reside in Works, Virginia. She is a mother of sons, Will, Mark, daughter, Carmen, the grandmother of twins, Bryce and Kylie, and a younger sister, Trinity.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Kai, for that introduction. I just would like to add my son-in-law, Carmen's husband, Edward, to that. He's the part of the family, and my daughter-in-laws, Chantal and Tanikia, because they're all family. So we are happy. I'm so glad to be here this afternoon and be a part of the conversation. Far too long, the humanity of the men have been disregarded, and we need to talk about that, and we need to put it in perspective as we go forward in addressing the inequity in healthcare. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today on behalf of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation. I'd like to thank Dr. Warren for inviting me to be a part of this afternoon and joining in the session for the 11th Annual National Center for Bioethics in Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee. It is a pleasure, Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble, to see you and to meet you. And I would like to ask if you would accept my thanks and appreciation for your chairmanship of the Legacy Committee that was the catalyst in getting the 1997 National Presidential Apology by then President William Jefferson Clinton 25 years later, I'm having the opportunity to say thank you, and I wish it was in person.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. That means a lot. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Today, as I reflect, 90 years after the infamous study of the U.S. Public Health Service lured 623 African-American men into an unnecessary and immoral research study of untreated syphilis. I can't tell you how overjoyed I am to have this opportunity to share some memories of these beloved men. The untold stories of our fathers, our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, uncles, cousins, neighbors have been disregarded until a few years ago. Thanks to the passion and dedicated work of some descendants, we are beginning to tell their stories, their family stories. What is known primarily about the men is how they were looked upon as being subhuman, unworthy, poor, uneducated, and used as clinical cadavers for doctors from the public health service. Something that is heart-wrenching to me, even as I speak. If only these character narratives and images remain, if they just remain, then the men will continue to be remembered as less than. For those of us who knew and dearly loved them, know them as the strong patriarchs of our families, as loving parents through our younger years when we were most mischievous. They provided us with food and shelter, and protected us from our fears, and encouraged us by relying on their faith that things would get better. They were resilient, faced each day with hopes of their lives getting better. As a descendant, I must, and all descendants, must tell who these human beings were and how they have impacted generations of descendants, their contributions to their communities, medical research, and their country. We all must remember them so that the words of my father are fulfilled. It is up to you to see that something like this never happens again. 90 years ago, I can imagine, in 1932, on those early fall crisp mornings in Tuskegee and Macon County, our ancestors were usually greeted with a spectacular sunrise. Those families, providers living in rural and impoverished county of Macon spent their days harvesting the shared crops, working at odd jobs, so there would be enough food, clothing, and shelter through the winter months. They had spent the spring and summer of this year working in vegetable gardens, tending their farm animals, and preparing the fields for corn, beans, and cotton. Precious little time and few opportunities were there for attending school and learning to read or write. But what they may have lacked in formal education was made up with life's experiences, their wisdom, common sense, and their God-given talents and gifts. Little time and even less money was available for doctor visits to address their health issues. They relied on family remedies that had been passed down from generations. To the contrary of what some might have thought, these men were health conscious and cared for their bodies. They had to stay strong and healthy just to survive. The most important things to them were caring and providing for their families, and the best and only ways they could in a community that offered few opportunities for the most marginalized. Many of the men migrated north after they entered the study for a better lifestyle. And most, if not all, did not know they had syphilis. These were Depression years with Jim Crow governance and widespread racism in Alabama. Living conditions were extremely difficult for Blacks living in the South. Economic depression, racial brutality, discrimination, social injustices, and health problems were common, especially with the poor rural community, within the poor rural communities. But the men's steadfast faith and courage strengthened them to transcend harsh realities of each day. To me, they were everyday saints. By the way, at the church, I went to Mass and it's All Saints Day. So, ordinary men surviving in a world that provided them with cruel hardships. For 40 years, their bodies were poked, prodded, and tapped. During the longevity of the study, they were never informed, never told they had syphilis, denied penicillin, and unaware of the harmful effects that syphilis had on their physical, mental, and social health. Now, I'd like for you to listen to 3 short stories, heartwarming stories of love and perseverance as told by their children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews. We will start with Mr. Gary Mitchell, shared by his daughters, Mrs. Florine Edwards, Mrs. Sally Fuller, and Mrs. Gertrude Flowers. Mr. Gary Mitchell, affectionately known as Slim, stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, was born in Macon County, Alabama, to the parents of John and Ella Mitchell. He grew up in a family of 12 siblings, which may have been the catalyst for his warm and caring personality. As a young man, he was attracted to and married Fannie C. Crowder. This union led to a family of 5. His 3 girls were spoiled by him. Our father worked as a mechanic, cement finisher, small appliance repairman, and many other odd jobs. His main skill was a heavy machine operator. He loved people, especially children and older citizens. He organized a Little League baseball team for children in the community. Occasionally, he would purchase and deliver meals to the elderly. Mr. Gary Mitchell's motto was, "I will do whatever I can do for the welfare and happiness of others." We feel fortunate to have had a father and grandfather who was kind enough to share that we discern as a dedication of the highest ideas of commitment. Our father was known as Big Daddy. Our father was a loving man. He loved people. He was an extrovert. He was a people person. There was nothing he wouldn't do for somebody. Let me live by the side of the road and be a friend to man. That was the motto that fit him. He didn't worry. If he had $5 to pay a bill and saw someone hungry, he would buy them food and pay the bill later. If anyone wanted to go anywhere, he always had a car to take them. Even if he wasn't feeling well, he'd still take them. When they would come in from church, he would tell folks to come on in. And mama would say, "Come on in for what?" And he'd answer, "Don't say that. They are hungry." Daddy had a good sense of humor. He used to say, "I'm going to die young because I don't want to look ugly. I want to be a good-looking corpse." When he had his garden, he had each of us to bring a box for our vegetables so that none of us would be able to say that he gave one sister more than he gave the other. Loving parent, human parent. Now, Mr. Fletcher Cox, as shared by Mrs. Ella Elijah, daughter, and Mrs. Carolyn Key, granddaughter. My grandfather, Coleman Vale, my daddy, Fletcher Cox, and my uncles, Richard Cox and Harvey Cox, were in the study. Imagine that. And this is how the study rampant not each, but some of the families. There were multiple family members in that study. We lived in Macon County. My daddy was a sharecropper. We lived in a house that the white man owned. You'd pick cotton and take it to the gin. When I was young, we used to plant cotton and corn. Sometimes you made $100 and other times nothing because the crops were poor. I used to ride on the back of the wagon to take the cotton to the gin. I dragged my feet on the ground. It was really hot. Sometimes we didn't have money for meals. Sometimes they didn't let them have anything. The whites owned the cotton gin. We had to pay to gin the cotton. And if you didn't have enough cotton to pay, they let you charge it. But then if you had to come back and pay the bill and didn't have enough money, you couldn't go back and charge the next time. My mother said, my father got sick. One day he came from the fields and tied his mule to the front porch and laid down on the porch. Mr. Calloway, the man who owned the house, came by and said, "Why are you laying on the porch and not working in the field? If you can't be in the field, you need to move out of the house." We had to move. I used to cry when I thought about this. He kept getting sick. He was in and out of the hospital. Mom raised 11 of us. I wanted to go to school and college, but couldn't because I had to take care of my mom. She would get sick sometimes. Without my mom, I don't know what we would have done. Mr. Ernest and Mr. Lewis Hendon, as shared by his nephew, Dr. Melvin Chambliss. My uncles, Ernest Hendon and Louis Hendon, were in the control group of the study. Uncle Louis, we sometimes call Uncle Bud, was slightly overweight in a good way. He was a kind individual. He was married and had 3 children. Both uncles were about 5'9" or 5'10". They were always there to protect the family. One of my most vivid memories was when the family all got together for Thanksgiving. All the adults sat at their table. Uncle Bud would give the blessing. My grandmother was living at the time and was matriarch of the family. So the family came over to our home to celebrate. Grandma, Uncle Ernest, and my aunt lived with us in that house. And Uncle Bud and his family and other aunts, uncles, and cousins would come over to celebrate the holidays. One Thanksgiving, my dad, Uncle Bud, and Uncle Ernest decided to purchase a live turkey and butcher it themselves. I was allowed to watch this event, and it was quite a sight to see. This large bird flopping around in the basement in a burlap sack. The brothers were always very close as youngsters, and even so when they moved, even more so when they moved to Cleveland. Uncle Bud passed in the 1970s. During my early years, our family would always visit his family. The entire Hendon family did this frequently. Uncle Bud was the eldest man in the family, and he was considered protective and strong for the family. Uncle Ernest was a bigger influence in my life because he lived with us in our house and provided the father figure when my dad was working. Sometimes, as a youngster, I slept upstairs with Uncle Ernest, who was a World War II veteran. He was a Jeep driver during the war, and I believe he was blown out of the Jeep or a mortar hit close to the Jeep or something. Whatever it was, I remember him having terrific night terror. That was scary to me. Now my father, Freddie Lee Tyson. And I will refer to him sometimes as my and our, but I have to say our because he was a father to 8 children and several grandchildren, of which Carmen is one of his pride and joy. Our father's birth name was Freddie Lee Tyson. However, during his lifetime, he was most lovingly called and known as Fred or Fred Lee. He was born October the 1st in 1905 in the Little Texas community where he was lured into the study. My mother's name was Johnny Mae Neal Tyson, born July 29th, 1911. And I mentioned my mother because my mother was a partner to my father, as all of those women and significant other women were to their husbands. They met at church, was married for 56 years, and raised 8 children. Although Dad only had the opportunity to complete his formal education to the 3rd grade, it did not inhibit him from becoming a lifelong learner. He was eager to learn and delighted in learning new skills. He attended the Rosenwald Elementary School in his Little Texas community. Dad's hobbies included hunting, fishing, gardening, and tack quilting, and of course, serving his family and neighbors. I wished everyone could have known our dad. He was the eldest of 6 children. As a young boy, he worked alongside his family as sharecroppers on Youngblood's farm in Little Texas. That's in Macon County. He was a man who fully accepted and carried out his responsibilities as a man, a husband, and a father. More importantly, Dad was loving gentle, faithful, and a caring neighbor. He was a hard worker, humorous, and compassionate. That was very conscientious about his health and physical appearance. This is one thing that also caused me quite heartburn because of how he was used and how he felt about his health. He believed in self-discipline and self-control. He frowned upon overindulging in food consumptions. He stayed active and remained in great physical condition all of his life. He was protective and deeply concerned for our safety and general welfare. We never went hungry, always had a safe, warm, and comfortable home to live in. We were poor, but we never felt poor. Our home was a place filled with love, understanding, sharing, respect, laughter, and yes, struggles and sadness. My father and the other men in the study trusted the doctors. They were betrayed, lied to, and treated inhumanely, only for the purpose to monitor the effects of early stages latent syphilis on their untreated bodies until their deaths, because the doctors and researchers believed Black people were biologically different from white people. They should have been treated ethically, honestly, and truthfully. They were human beings, not lab specimens. They were worthy of proper medical treatment and respect. These stories show the men's humanities, how their wives cared for them, their children, grandchildren admired and loved them, how they were caring neighbors, pillars of the community, and closeness they had with their families. Similar stories of these men are told by 50 other descendants and will be included in Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation research project, The Untold Stories, by co-authors Dr. Villa Payne Jackson, anthropologist and professor at Howard University, Dr. Rueben C. Warren, and myself, and of course, all of the descendants. This is an opportunity for us to honor and remember their sacrifices, to remember their humanity, because if we don't share their legacies and find answers to unanswered questions still haunting descendants and others perhaps by that study, and make healthcare equitable and ethical for everyone, especially those who are in most needs, we cannot begin addressing the moral determinants of health, what we do with what we know. We must continue to move forward, to be enlightened, to be proud, to remember, and to lift up each other for the betterment of all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Head. Now we'll be introducing Dr. Warren. Dr. Rueben C. Warren is currently the director of the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare and professor of bioethics at Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. He is also former director of the Institute for Faith, Health, Leadership, and adjunct professor of public health, medicine, and ethics in the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, from 1988 to 1997. Dr. Warren served as Associate Director for Minority Health at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 1997 to 2004. He was Associate Director for Urban Affairs at the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry from 2005 to 2007. Dr. Warren served part-time as Director of Infrastructure Development for the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland from 2004 to 2009. He was on leave from the National Center for Environmental Health in Atlanta, where he served as Associate Director for Environmental Justice. As Associate Director at CDC, Dr. Warren had led agency responsibility for environmental justice and minority health. Prior to joining the CDC, Dr. Warren served as Dean and Associate Professor in the School of Dentistry, Department of Preventative Dentistry and Community Health at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. He is also Clinical Professor, Department of Community Health, Preventative Medicine, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Adjunct Professor, Department of Behavioral Sciences and Health Education, Rollins School of Public Health, Emory University, both in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Warren is also Adjunct Professor in the Department of Dental Public Health, School of Dentistry, and Adjunct Professor in the School of Graduate Studies and Research at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Warren earned his undergraduate degree from San Francisco State University, his dental degree from Meharry Medical College, and both master's and doctorate degrees from the Harvard School of Public Health. He also completed a 2-year residency at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine and Dental Public Health. He is board certified in dental public health. Dr. Warren also completed a Master of Divinity from the Interdenominational Theological Center with a concentration in theology and ethics. Dr. Warren is an ordained minister. In June 1990, Dr. Warren received the Distinguished Harvard Alumni Award. In May 1999, he was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Medical Science from Meharry Medical College. In 2000, he received the President's Distinguished Service Award, Meharry Medical College. In October 2003, Dr. Warren's academic status at Meharry's Dental School was elevated to Dean Emeritus. Later in October of that same year, he was inducted into the American College of Dentists. In 2009, he received a certificate through an intensive bioethics course at Georgetown University Kennedy Institute of Ethics, Washington, D.C. In May 2010, Dr. Warren received the Michael C. Alfano Award from New York College of Dentistry for promoting diversity in dental education in 2011. Dr. Warren was inducted honorary into Delta Omega Public Health Honorary Society in 2013. Dr. Warren was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Meharry Medical College. Please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Rueben Warren.
Good afternoon, and I am absolutely speechless. We have heard testimonies, one in theory and the other in practice. So in the interest of time and not to take from what you've heard, because you need to reflect on it for a moment. And I'm going to just eliminate my comments because you've heard the story. And the question that is before us, and you're going to hear it from another scholar, is what is the vision, or what do we do with what we've heard? What do we do with what we know? So again, I'm speechless, and I don't want to take any more time, but refer to our next presenter, a dear friend and colleague who's been a part of this journey for many, many years. So you'll hear from me again later on the program. So I'm going to refer back to our host.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear from Dr. Warren again tomorrow, and you'll hear from him again the next day. So Dr. Warren will have opportunity to kind of give his reflections on these matters. So thank you, Dr. Warren, for proceeding your time. Because like Dr. Northington Gamble said in the beginning, 15 minutes is not enough, especially when you have questions that was thought-provoking as the one we received. So thank you so much, so much, so much.